There was a time in our neighborhood when fear was used as a weapon. It didn't come from strangers far away, but from people who lived just down the street. James, a man blinded by power and ego, thought control meant sending shadows into the lives of others. He sent bikers to scare my wife, believing that intimidation could silence dignity, that fear could break the spirit of a family. But here's the truth: history has shown us time and again ordinary people have always held extraordinary strength. My wife, standing at that door, wasn't just a woman confronted by thugs. She was the quiet voice of every neighbor who'd been bullied by authority, every resident who'd felt powerless in the face of injustice. And when those men, sent to frighten her, came back minutes later to knock on my door in surrender, it wasn't just a personal victory. It was a sign of something far greater. Because intimidation can't outlast integrity. Threats can't silence the truth, and fear cannot survive in the presence of courage. Think about it. Every great change in history has been carried forward not by the powerful few, but by the steady hands and unshakable hearts of ordinary people. Rosa Parks was just one woman on a bus. Nelson Mandela was just one prisoner in a cell. And yet, through perseverance, through belief, they reminded us all that even in the smallest corners of community life, extraordinary change is possible. This isn't just an HOA story. It's the story of what happens when neighbors stand for one another, when we refuse to let fear dictate our future. It's about the choice each of us has: to bow to intimidation or to rise with integrity, to accept things as they are or to fight for what they can become. Yes, James sent his men to scare a family. But what happened next showed the whole community that we are stronger than fear, stronger than bullying, stronger than the lies of power. We are bound together not by intimidation, but by unity, respect, and the belief that we deserve better. So, tonight, as we reflect on this story, let it remind us all we are not helpless, we are not weak. And no matter how small we may feel, each of us has the power to bring light where others try to cast shadows. Our neighborhoods, our communities, our families. They don't change because one man decides to flex his control. They change because men and women like you and me decide to stand firm, to hold the line, and to refuse to fear a seat at our table. So let this story not be one of intimidation, but one of transformation. Let it echo with the truth that no amount of force can suppress the courage of people united in hope. Because in the end, the future doesn't belong to fear. It belongs to those who persevere, those who believe, and those who dare to rise. It was a quiet night. The kind of night where the air is still, where the streets are empty, and the world feels almost safe. My wife was in the living room, the glow of the lamp painting soft shadows on the wall. The smell of coffee lingered, the comfort of routine filling the silence of our home. And then it happened. A sound, faint at first, like a low growl in the distance. The kind of sound you tell yourself is nothing, maybe the wind, maybe a passing engine, but then it grew louder, stronger. The roar of engines tearing through the stillness, breaking the night like a hammer against glass. I walked toward the window, and that's when I saw them. Bikers. A swarm of them, their headlights slicing through the darkness, their presence heavy and deliberate. They weren't passing through. They slowed, circling, the rumble of their engines echoing against the houses, rattling windows, shaking the calm out of the night. My heart sank, because I knew this wasn't random. This wasn't a chance, this was sent. Every person knows the difference between coincidence and intention. This wasn't a coincidence. James had finally made his move. He thought that by sending fear, wrapped in leather jackets and chrome, by surrounding my home with shadows, he could silence us. He thought my wife would be terrified, that the sight of intimidation would paralyze her, that our home would crumble under the weight of threats. But fear doesn't always work the way men like James expect. My wife stood up from her chair, her face pale, her eyes wide, but steady. She moved to the door, not with recklessness, not with anger, but with a quiet resolve. There's something in a person when they decide they won't bow down, when they realize fear only has as much power as you give it. She placed her hand on the doorframe, listening to the engines as they roared outside, and for a moment, the whole house seemed to hold its breath. The pounding came next. Not polite knocking, not hesitation. Pounding, fists slamming against wood like they owned it, like they believed this house, this life, this family could be broken by noise and threat. Each strike against the door echoed in my chest. It wasn't just sound. It was a message. A declaration. A warning that they thought they were in control. I stood a few steps back, my hands clenched, every instinct screaming to protect, to fight, to push back. But my wife, she didn't step back. She stood there, still, silent, listening. That silence was heavier than their pounding, because silence carries something intimidation can't touch, control, and in that silence, as the bikers pounded on our door, as their engines roared like thunder, as the night itself seemed to collapse under their presence, something shifted. The fear they thought they carried with them didn't fill the room the way they intended. It bounced back. It hung in the air like smoke they couldn't clear. Through the peephole I saw their faces. Men who wanted to look dangerous, but whose eyes betrayed something else. Hesitation. Doubt, a flicker of uncertainty. They had come to scare, but already, in those first moments, you could see it. Fear was turning on them. The neighborhood was dark, but behind curtains, I knew eyes were watching. Neighbors who'd heard the noise. Families who felt the vibration of engines rattling their walls. James had tried to send a message of power, but what he really sent was a display of desperation. And desperation always cracks under its own weight. My wife leaned her forehead against the door for a moment, steadying her breath as the pounding grew louder. The wood shook. The glass in the frames rattled. The house groaned under the pressure, but she didn't move. She didn't flinch. She didn't give them what they came for. And in that moment I realized something. Fear had knocked on our door, but it hadn't entered. It was outside, trapped in the roar of engines, in the fists of men trying too hard to look unbreakable. Inside there was something else, something stronger. The night wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But the question remained, suspended in the silence between each pounding strike. Who was really afraid now? James had always believed control was power. Not earned respect, not trust, not leadership, but control. The kind that comes from intimidation, from whispered threats behind closed doors, from making others bend before they even realize they're bending. He was the kind of man who thought silence meant victory, who thought people feared him because they respected him. But deep down, everyone knew. It wasn't respectful. It was compliance born out of fear. In the HOA meetings, James didn't speak like a neighbor. He spoke like a ruler. His words weren't suggestions, they were ultimatums. His gaze wasn't one of understanding, it was one of surveillance. Like he was always calculating, always measuring, always looking for the weakest link. And when people nodded along, when they avoided confrontation, James took it as proof of his dominance. What he didn't realize was that every nod was just another seed of quiet resentment growing under the surface. Still, James had a plan. He had been watching me and my family, testing boundaries, waiting for the moment when he could assert his authority. He saw that we didn't bow, that we didn't fall in line like the others. That unsettled him. To a man like James, one voice of resistance was louder than 100 voices of submission, and that single voice was enough to threaten the empire of fear he had built. So he plotted, not out in the open, not in the daylight, but in whispers, in secret conversations with men who owed him favors. He leaned on the shadows, believing they could do what he couldn't, instill a kind of terror that words alone could not carry. He wanted to send a message, not just to me, but to everyone who dared to watch. A message that resistance had consequences, that stepping out of line would bring the weight of his wrath to your doorstep. The bikers weren't chosen by accident. James knew the effect they'd have. The sound of their engines tearing through a quiet neighborhood, the sight of their jackets gleaming under the streetlights, the sheer force of their presence. It was theater. A stage play of fear written by a man who thought intimidation was art. He wanted the neighborhood to hear them, to see them, to feel them. He wanted the fear to spread faster than the truth. But what James didn't account for was the flaw in every plan built on control. Fear is unstable. It's a fire that spreads quickly, but it consumes itself just as fast. The bikers weren't loyal to James. They weren't bound by his authority. They were tools, weapons sent forward with the promise of payment or favor. And tools, when misused, don't always strike the target. Sometimes, they cut the hand that wields them. As I pieced together his plan, the layers became clear. This wasn't about one night. This was about dominance. About making an example. He wanted neighbors to look out their windows, to see what happened to someone who dared stand up. He wanted whispers to ripple through the streets, fear to settle in living rooms, compliance to cement itself in silence. He wanted to create not just fear of him, but fear of even questioning him, and in his mind that night was the perfect moment. He thought he had orchestrated a flawless display, a scene that would secure his control for years to come. He thought the pounding fists and roaring engines would echo in every heart and every home. But the cracks were already there. In his plan, in his vision of power, in the very foundation of his control, because fear doesn't last when it collides with courage. Intimidation doesn't hold when the one being threatened refuses to bend. And control isn't real when it's built on nothing but smoke and shadows. James didn't know it yet, but the very plan he believed would secure his dominance was the one that would begin to unravel it. He thought he was sending fear to my doorstep, but fear has a strange way of turning back on the man who sends it. And as the engines roared outside, as his men pounded on the door, as the night carried the weight of his plan, a question rose unspoken, hovering in the air with every vibration of sound, every tremor in the walls. What happens when control begins to lose control? The night had already changed when I heard the first distant rumble. At first, it was easy to ignore. The soft hum of engines miles away, nothing more than a disturbance in the otherwise quiet evening. But then it grew louder, sharper, and insistent. A low vibration beneath the feet, a rhythm that seemed to synchronize with the heartbeat of the house. My wife paused, a cup of tea in her hand, listening. I could see the tension in her shoulders, subtle but unmistakable. Something was coming, something not ordinary. Through the window, the first silhouettes emerged, streaks of light bouncing off chrome, reflections darting against the pavement. It wasn't one or two motorcycles. There were dozens. They moved with a precision that was almost choreographed, yet carried the raw, unpredictable edge of danger. Each bike approached like a predator circling its prey, the sound of their engines rolling over the quiet streets like thunder from a storm we hadn't seen coming. And then I realized this wasn't random. This wasn't a coincidence. This was intentional. I had seen groups like this before in passing, on highways, on movies, in stories people told to impress or scare. But this was different. There was a weight behind their presence, a deliberate energy that suggested they were sent with purpose. They weren't here to ride, they were here to intimidate. My mind raced. Who had orchestrated this? What had triggered such an extreme reaction? And then it clicked. James. Only James would think fear could be delivered in leather and steel. Only James would send men to transform his threats into an audible, undeniable presence. As they slowed near the curb, the full force of their numbers became visible. Faces hidden behind helmets, eyes peering through visors, posture rigid with expectation. They were waiting. I could feel the tension in the air, thick and almost tangible, pressing against the walls of our home. The quiet of the neighborhood had been shattered, replaced by the symphony of engines and distant echoes of tires against asphalt. My wife and I exchanged a glance, silent communication that didn't need words. She understood as I did. This wasn't just about us. This was a statement, a warning, and for the first time, I noticed the subtle hesitations in their formation. The way one rider's hand lingered on the throttle, the way another shifted uneasily in the saddle. There was a hint of uncertainty hidden beneath the bravado, a crack in the armor of what they intended to project. I thought about every story I'd ever heard of intimidation, every narrative where a group tried to exert control and failed. And yet, the suspense of the moment was palpable. Every second stretched longer than it should, each engine's rumble a reminder that danger was close enough to touch. Outside, the bikers' formation seemed unyielding, but something in the way they moved hinted that the plan was not as flawless as James believed. Then came the sound that made the room still. A knock on the door, delayed but deliberate, that seemed to pierce the roaring engines. My wife stiffened. I could feel her pulse, rapid yet controlled, a mixture of fear and determination. Whoever had sent them hadn't predicted this, hadn't counted on resistance manifesting not in confrontation, but in stillness. Fear had been expected to flow one way, but the energy in the room told another story. I watched the leader, the one at the front of the formation, a tall figure in black leather, helmet reflecting the faint glow of the street lamp. His posture was confident, but the slight tilt of his head betrayed a mind calculating something beyond his control. Who is really in charge here? I wondered. Was it James, hidden behind the scenes, or was it this man at the front, wondering if the plan would work, wondering what would happen if it didn't? Every second was drawn out, every movement loaded with implication. The bikers waited, engines humming like coiled springs, muscles taut, ready to strike, but hesitant. Hesitation is a dangerous thing in moments designed for intimidation. One wrong glance, one flicker of doubt, and the balance shifts entirely, and I could feel it shifting. Though how, I didn't yet know. The suspense in the air was almost unbearable. The neighborhood, silent except for the low roar outside, seemed to hold its collective breath. And inside, my wife and I stood together watching, listening, feeling the immense weight of a situation orchestrated by a man who believed control could be bought or demanded. But control has a fragile nature. It cannot fully exist where courage waits quietly, patiently, ready to meet it. And as the bikers lingered on the curb, engines idling, anticipation brimming on every helmeted face, one question lingered in my mind, unspoken and unanswerable in the moment. Who would truly be the one holding power when the first move was made? The moment she moved toward the door, the room seemed to shrink. Every shadow in the corners stretched longer, every sound from outside, the roar of engines, the faint shuffle of boots on asphalt, became amplified. My wife's steps were deliberate, calm, but I could feel the tension radiating from her like heat from an open flame. She paused for a heartbeat, hand hovering over the doorknob, as if sensing the storm just beyond the wood. There's a peculiar clarity that comes in moments like this. Time slows, perception sharpens, and every detail demands attention. I noticed the faint quiver in her fingers, the way her shoulders straightened as though bracing not only herself, but everyone who depended on her courage. Her eyes scanned the dim light outside, trying to read the unknown, to predict the unpredictable. And yet, despite the fear, she moved forward. Outside, the bikers had stopped their circle. Engines idling, bodies tense, the air vibrating with controlled aggression. They weren't just waiting. They were expecting a reaction, one that would confirm their dominance, and I could see it in the leader's stance, the one at the front. A subtle shift in posture, a tightening of fists under leather gloves, a glance toward someone behind him, as though silently asking, "Are you sure she's alone?" It was in that moment I realized the suspense wasn't only ours to feel. It was theirs too. The fear they carried with them wasn't entirely confidence. Something unspoken had started to creep in. Perhaps it was uncertainty. Perhaps it was the realization that the plan could fail. Perhaps it was the knowledge that facing someone who does not yield changes the dynamic entirely. My wife's hand touched the doorknob. A soft inhale, almost imperceptible, and then a firm twist. The door creaked just slightly, enough to let them know someone was there, alert, aware, and unbroken. I could see her glance toward me, a silent signal that the next moment belonged to her, that the power of presence mattered more than any threat waiting outside. And then the pounding began. Fists against wood, deliberate, forceful, meant to intimidate. A synchronized rhythm, like the measured heartbeat of something threatening, reminding us that someone had intended to instill fear here. But she didn't flinch. She didn't step back. The silence she held between her steps, the stillness she carried, became a shield stronger than any barricade. I watched the leader from behind his visor, the tall man at the front of the circle. For the first time, I saw hesitation ripple across his body. His eyes, though hidden, betrayed something that words could not doubt. Every pounding strike against the door seemed to land not on wood, but on his certainty. His gaze flicked to the others. His shoulders tensed. He was questioning what he had brought with him, questioning whether this confrontation would truly follow the path he thought it would. The night itself seemed to lean in closer, holding its breath. The rumble of the engines softened, almost in awe, as though even the world sensed the tension in the doorway. Outside, the bikers exchanged subtle glances. Their synchronization wavered, one rider's hand drifting from the throttle, another shifting uncomfortably on his seat. They had expected fear to greet them, obedience to bow, yet it did not. Inside, my wife remained steadfast. Every movement calculated, measured, yet natural. A quiet defiance that made the air dense with suspense. The difference between fear and courage is subtle, almost imperceptible, until the moment it becomes undeniable. And in that space, in that pause between pounding and silence, everything seemed suspended, waiting for the first crack, the first sign of weakness. And then there was a flicker in the leader's eyes, one small, almost invisible change that made the rest of the group shift in response. The uncertainty was spreading like a ripple across water, and it centered entirely on a single question he dared not voice: what happens if this one person doesn't break? What happens if courage meets intimidation and refuses to yield? Every second stretched. Every breath seemed heavier. The pounding against the door was relentless, yet my wife's presence absorbed it rather than reacting to it. She was still calm, at the center of a storm, the eye in the circle of chaos. And from where I stood, I could see the shift. The leader's control was no longer absolute. A subtle tremor, a hesitation, a silent reckoning that this plan, built to dominate, was encountering something it could not predict. The suspense was unbearable. Outside, in the faint glow of the street lamp, the question hovered over them all: who truly held the power in that moment? The men who came to intimidate, or the woman who refused to be intimidated? After the initial pounding, after the engine's roar faded into a tense hum, a silence fell that felt heavier than anything before it. 3 minutes stretched like an eternity. Every second seemed to thrum with expectation, each heartbeat echoing through the walls of the house. My wife stood by the door, still unwavering, as if the very air around her had hardened into a shield. Outside, the bikers hesitated, engines idling, hands hovering over grips and fists, caught in a moment that none of them could control. Time became a tangible presence, each tick of a clock replaced by the unspoken weight of uncertainty. Who would make the first move? Who would crack under the pressure? Who would let fear decide the next moment? And in that silence, I felt it most. The question I hadn't dared to articulate before, now looming over the entire street like a shadow: who really held the power here? My wife didn't speak, she didn't gesture. She didn't invite them in, nor did she retreat. The quiet she carried was deliberate, commanding, unyielding. It wasn't just silence, it was resistance. And in that resistance, there was an unspoken message: intimidation will not work when faced with someone unbroken. Outside, the bikers shifted. One moved slightly, another adjusted the angle of his helmet, a subtle exchange of glances suggesting doubt. The leader, the one at the front, remained motionless, yet his tension was visible even through the visor. His body spoke of indecision, a silent war between the confidence he tried to project and the uncertainty creeping in. 3 minutes of silence, and suddenly the whole plan James had orchestrated seemed fragile. It was remarkable how silence could carry more weight than noise. The pounding on the door had been thunderous, but the quiet that followed was heavier, denser, charged with electricity. Each biker could feel it. Each one could sense the imbalance, the unexpected twist that had shifted the momentum. And yet no one dared break it. The moment belonged to my wife, to the stillness that had turned the confrontation inward. In the house, the walls seemed to absorb the tension, every shadow stretching longer, darker, sharper. I could hear her breath, steady, controlled, a rhythm that refused to be disturbed. I could see the muscles in her jaw tighten, not with fear, but with resolve. And I knew, as I watched, that whatever came next would not be dictated by James or by the men he sent. It would be dictated by the courage that had taken root in the quietest part of the room. Outside, the leader's mind raced. He had expected resistance, but never this kind of unyielding stillness. His confidence faltered, the certainty of his mission wavering in the face of something he had not accounted for. The 3 minutes dragged, stretching his patience, his control, his understanding of the situation. The others looked to him, waiting for a cue, a command, a signal that would tell them how to act. And yet, the signal did not come. Silence had taken its place. I noticed small signs: the subtle twitch of a hand, a shift in weight from one foot to another, the eyes behind the helmets flicking toward one another. The riders were beginning to question. Not openly, not yet, but internally, their minds were turning over the possibilities. What if the person behind the door wasn't afraid? What if the intimidation that had been planned so carefully was losing its grip, dissolving in the face of courage they couldn't measure? 3 minutes is not long, and yet, in that moment, it felt infinite. Every second carried the weight of unspoken decisions, every silence a mirror reflecting the vulnerability of those who thought they were in control. And in that infinite pause, the question hung, unanswerable, pulsating through the night air: who truly had the upper hand? Was it the one who had sent them, orchestrated the plan, or the one who stood silently, commanding the room without a word? Inside, the calm was deliberate, almost surgical, cutting through the chaos outside. Every inch of the room seemed attuned to her presence, every sound of the outside world absorbed and filtered by the quiet strength at the door. And as the seconds ticked, a subtle shift began among the bikers. Hesitation transforming into doubt, doubt into uncertainty, uncertainty threatening to fracture the illusion of control that had brought them here. And yet, the 3 minutes had not ended. The street remained heavy with anticipation, every eye fixed on the door, every mind calculating, every breath waiting for the first sign, the first crack, the first acknowledgement of what was about to happen next. The silence that had stretched over those 3 minutes was finally broken. Not by engines, not by shouting, not by movement outside, but by a single deliberate knock. One knock. Sharp, measured, almost polite in its precision, yet carrying the weight of something far more dangerous. It reverberated through the quiet house like a bell tolling in a cathedral, demanding attention, commanding awareness. My wife's hand remained on the doorknob, yet I could feel the tension spike as our eyes met, both of us realizing that the next moment could define everything. There's a peculiar kind of suspense that comes from sound. A single note, cutting through the hum of expectation. That knock wasn't casual, it was intentional, calculated to make whoever stood behind the door pause, to force a reaction, to test courage. And for a brief moment, I wondered, who was really knocking? The leader, the one orchestrating the intimidation? Or someone else entirely, caught in the collision of plans that James had so arrogantly set into motion? The street outside had fallen eerily quiet, the engines now a low purr rather than a roar, as if the bikers themselves were holding their collective breath. The knock echoed again, a subtle reminder that hesitation could be exploited, that fear could be manipulated if the wrong response was given. And yet, the door did not open. My wife's silence was a defiance stronger than words, a wall against the energy pressing in from outside. I could feel it in the leader's body even through the helmets and leather. He shifted slightly, a subtle, almost imperceptible motion, but enough to reveal the doubt beginning to seep in. He had expected panic, or at least hesitation that would give him an edge. He had expected to see fear reflected in the eyes behind the door, and instead he found stillness. A calm that made every calculated move suddenly uncertain. One knock, one sound, and the illusion of control he carried with him wavered like a candle in the wind. Inside, my wife's hand tightened on the doorknob, a small, deliberate gesture, and in that action, the power of presence became undeniable. The knock was meant to provoke, to intimidate, to force compliance, yet it achieved something entirely different. It measured courage, and courage was standing firm. It was a silent question sent through a wooden door. Do you bend? Do you yield? And the answer was not forthcoming. Outside, the bikers exchanged subtle glances. The leader's hesitation had spread to them like ripples across water. Hands shifted from grips to knees, boots shuffled against asphalt, and the air seemed to thicken with unspoken tension. They were waiting for a signal, a cue, a break in the calm that would tell them how to act. But the signal did not come. The knock had introduced suspense, uncertainty, and the awareness that the situation could pivot at any moment, entirely dependent on a single, unspoken decision. And then I noticed it. A flicker in the leader's eyes, just a shadow of doubt, a silent question. What happens if this person does not respond as expected? What if fear cannot be summoned? His posture betrayed him, the lines of authority softening as the possibility of failure crept into his calculations. One knock had become a turning point, the pause between expectation and reality stretching into something almost unbearable. The world outside seemed to mirror the tension within. Trees swayed slightly, their branches scratching against the dim streetlights, the wind whispering through the leaves, as though nature itself was acknowledging the suspense. Every element of the night was aligned, focused on that single point of contact. The door, the knock, the person who held the room in their grasp without moving a muscle. Inside, my wife's breath was steady, controlled, a rhythm that contrasted with the building anxiety outside. Every moment she remained poised increased the pressure on the men beyond the door. Every second of stillness shifted the balance of power. They had come to intimidate, to impose control, to test boundaries, yet in that brief silence punctuated by a single knock, the narrative had begun to change. And as the knock came again, deliberate, measured, echoing through the quiet house, the unspoken question hung over everyone in the night. Who truly has the power in this confrontation? The ones sent to command fear or the person standing silently refusing to let it in. The pounding had stopped, but the tension had not. Outside, the bikers remained, engines humming low, bodies rigid, poised like statues carved for intimidation. They had come to enforce fear, to bend will with sheer presence, yet in that moment, something invisible had shifted. A crack in the structure of power that James had built so carefully. The house was silent except for the faint whisper of the night wind, but inside I could feel the energy bending toward a new direction. Fear, as I had come to understand over these minutes, is fragile. It relies on certainty, on the assumption that the target will react predictably, and when it encounters resistance it cannot measure, it begins to unravel. The leader of the group, the man at the front who carried the weight of authority for all who followed, began to show subtle signs of fracture. His body language, previously rigid and commanding, now betrayed hesitation. A twitch of the shoulder, a tilt of the head, a brief glance at the others as though seeking reassurance that no one else had noticed the shift. My wife remained at the door, poised, unmoved, a quiet center of power that no roar or hammering could disrupt. And as I watched, I realized that the collapse of intimidation often begins not with a grand act of defiance, but with something far subtler, the absence of the expected reaction. They had anticipated fear, a flinch, a retreat, a trembling acknowledgement of their presence. They did not anticipate stillness, or control, or courage that refused to bend. The first sign came from the edges of their formation. One biker's hand slid away from the throttle. Another shifted weight from one foot to the other. A flicker of unease passed through them, subtle but undeniable. And the leader noticed it, because his eyes narrowed, scanning each of them, calculating, realizing that the plan's precision was beginning to fail. The intimidation that had been meant to impose order now carried the weight of doubt. In that silence, I could almost hear their thoughts, unspoken yet palpable. Is this working? Have we misjudged? Why is she not afraid? These questions spread like wildfire through the group, infecting even those who had tried to hide it beneath layers of bravado. One by one, the veneer of confidence began to crack, revealing vulnerability beneath the leather jackets and helmets. The more they hesitated, the more their presence lost potency, until the air itself seemed to sense the collapse, thickening with tension as uncertainty took hold. The leader's posture shifted again, a subtle sway, a micro-expression that suggested he was recalculating everything he thought he knew about control. His mind was working furiously, running through contingencies, imagining scenarios, wondering if the very act that had been meant to dominate would instead humiliate him. The hierarchy he had assumed would hold through fear was dissolving before his eyes, and yet he could not show weakness. Not yet. Inside, my wife remained the axis of the storm, unmoving, unshaken. Every knock, every echo of the motorcycles, every glimmer of doubt in the leader's eyes reflected back into the room, reinforcing the quiet power of presence. And I could feel it in the subtle energy of the night. Intimidation, no matter how loud or forceful, begins to collapse when it meets resolve it cannot sway. The suspense intensified because no one could predict what would happen next. The leader, the figure who had carried the weight of authority, could act in 1,000 ways, some calculated, some desperate. The group behind him, watching and waiting, was caught between obedience and the dawning realization that their plan might fail. Every second stretched longer, every breath carried more weight, and the silence between actions became as threatening as any engine roar or pounding fist. It was in that silence that the full impact of the collapse revealed itself. Intimidation relies on projection, on the assumption that others will internalize the threat. But projection is fragile, and when it encounters steadfast courage, it begins to bend, to twist, to fail. The leader's mind wrestled with this. He could see it now. The carefully constructed illusion of dominance was beginning to unravel, and the consequences of failure were imminent yet unpredictable. And as the bikers shifted, uncertainty spread among them like wildfire. The most dangerous question hung in the air, suspended and unspoken: who truly holds the power now? The ones who came to impose fear, or the one who refused to give it a foothold? Courage is never loud. It doesn't announce itself with engines or pounding fists. It is quiet, subtle, almost invisible to those who rely on intimidation to gauge strength. But it is also undeniable, and in the stillness of that house, in the pause between each uncertain breath, courage revealed itself with clarity. My wife's presence at the door, unwavering, unflinching, carried the weight of something far greater than fear, a truth that even the most seasoned intimidators cannot measure until it confronts them directly. Outside, the bikers shifted uneasily. The leader, whose confidence had once seemed unshakable, began to betray signs of internal conflict. His eyes, scanning the street and glancing toward the others, flickered with the recognition that courage cannot be contained, cannot be commanded, and cannot be bought. He had come expecting submission, a reaction he could control, a fear he could orchestrate. Instead, he faced quiet defiance, a stillness that unsettled everything he thought he knew. It is in moments like this that courage's true power becomes apparent. It does not fight with force. It does not respond to threats with aggression. Instead, it holds its ground, observes, measures, and silently asserts that there is more at stake than immediate danger. Each passing second outside became a testament to that truth. The longer my wife remained steadfast, the more the biker's confidence waned, the more the illusion of control cracked. I noticed the subtle signs first in the leader. The way his jaw tightened, the brief clench of his fists, the almost imperceptible nod toward a subordinate, as if seeking validation for the mounting unease. His mind was racing, calculating, but also faltering. He had trained for intimidation, for asserting dominance, for controlling situations like this one. And yet here, standing silently at a door, courage was teaching him a lesson he had not anticipated. Every second stretched like a tightrope, balanced between fear and defiance, between threat and resilience. The bikers had come to impose power, but power is fragile in the face of courage that refuses to bend. Subtle gestures, small shifts in posture, micro-expressions. All of these revealed the invisible struggle occurring within each of them. They had expected immediate results, quick compliance, but instead, they were confronted with a force that could not be measured by speed or volume, only by endurance. I could feel it in the air, a shift in the dynamics of control. The leader's eyes darted back and forth between the street and the door, calculating probabilities, guessing every assumption he had made. His mind worked frantically to regain dominance, but every calculation was met with a new reality. Courage was not a variable he could manipulate. The others sensed it too. Their formation wavered, movement slowed, and subtle hesitation rippled through the group like a warning that their mission was no longer straightforward. And yet, courage carries with it a paradox. It does not seek victory in the conventional sense. It does not shout, it does not command, it does not force change. It exists quietly, persistently, a still point in the storm, revealing the fragility of intimidation. Each second my wife remained unmoved. Each breath she took calmly despite the chaos outside magnified the uncertainty in the minds of the bikers. I could see it most clearly in the leader's eyes. A flicker of doubt, a hesitation that grew into uncertainty. The question he had not dared to voice yet haunted every calculated move. What happens if this person does not yield? What happens if fear is powerless here? His mind wrestled with possibilities, each one destabilizing the plan he had so meticulously set into motion. Courage has a way of creating suspense not by action, but by inaction. It forces those who rely on fear to confront something they cannot understand, a presence they cannot control, a truth they cannot dominate. And in that moment, the truth became clear: it is not the loudest, nor the most aggressive, who hold power. It is the steady, the steadfast, the unwavering, those who, despite the threat, refuse to be broken. The street outside remained tense, every biker waiting for a cue, every mind balancing between obedience and the dawning realization that their plan might fail. The leader's thoughts spiraled with a single question, one that hovered over the night like an invisible hand. Who truly wields power in this moment? The ones attempting to instill fear, or the one who simply stands firm against it? History has a way of whispering lessons to those who are willing to listen. It reminds us that courage is not always the act of kings or generals, but often the quiet, determined choices of ordinary people who refuse to be bowed by force. In the shadow of that night, with the bikers waiting outside, I could feel the weight of every story that had ever been told about defiance, about standing firm when the world seemed determined to crush you. Each example from the past seemed to pulse through the air like a heartbeat, reminding me that bravery is contagious and resistance, even against overwhelming odds, can ripple outward in ways that are impossible to measure. I thought about the individuals who had changed the course of communities, nations, And lives, people who, like my wife at the door, had faced intimidation with nothing but resolve. Rosa Parks, who refused to yield a seat, ordinary men and women who challenged unjust systems, one small act at a time, communities that had banded together when faced with the threat of silence or submission. None of them had shouted. None of them had boasted. They had simply stood firm, and in that standing, they had rewritten what was possible. Outside, the bikers' formation wavered as the minutes stretched on. The leader, still poised at the front, seemed to sense the historical weight pressing down on him. Perhaps he did not consciously understand it, but instinctively, he felt the power that comes from an unbroken resolve. He had expected fear, a quick submission, a reaction that would confirm his dominance. Instead, he faced the quiet embodiment of every story of resistance that had come before him. The weight of history itself seemed to press against his leather jacket, challenging every assumption he had made. My wife's posture at the door mirrored the lessons whispered through time, steadfast, calm, deliberate. She held the room with her presence, absorbing the tension outside and reflecting it back in a way that magnified the uncertainty in the minds of those who had come to intimidate. I watched as doubt began to ripple through the bikers, subtle, almost imperceptible gestures that betrayed the growing instability in their resolve. A finger slid from a throttle, a helmet tilted slightly, a boot shifted on asphalt. These were small, human cracks in what had been presented as unbreakable force. And in that quiet, suspended moment, I realized that history is not just in books or stories. It is alive in the choices we make when faced with fear. Every second my wife held her ground was a lesson in legacy, a reminder that those who refuse to yield leave an imprint far beyond the immediate moment. It was a reminder that courage is both contagious and catalytic. One act can inspire countless others, a chain reaction that begins in the simplest, most human ways, standing firm, holding the line, refusing to be broken. The leader at the front of the formation seemed to sense it now. His eyes, scanning the street and the quiet house, reflected the dawning awareness that his plan might be failing. Every micro-expression, every tiny shift in stance, revealed the internal battle raging in his mind. He had come prepared to command fear, to enforce dominance, to orchestrate submission. Yet standing before him was the living proof that control is fragile when confronted by courage steeped in principle and quiet defiance. I could almost hear his thoughts, unspoken yet clear in every movement, every glance toward the others. Why isn't she afraid? How can someone so small, so ordinary, wield so much power over us? That question hung in the night like a heavy fog, seeping into the consciousness of everyone present. The bikers, once confident and synchronized, now teetered on the edge of doubt, unsure of the next step, uncertain of the chain of command, unsure if the next action would secure their dominance or accelerate its collapse. It is in moments like these that history reminds us that the extraordinary often emerges from the ordinary. The ones who are not expected to act, who are underestimated, who appear quiet or unremarkable, can shift the balance of power simply by refusing to participate in the illusion of fear. My wife at the door, silent yet unyielding, was living proof that the lessons of history are not confined to past pages. They breathe and manifest in the choices we make today. And as the street remained silent, the bikers frozen in hesitation, and the leader wrestled with uncertainty, a single impossible question lingered in the air like a taut wire ready to snap in the quiet resolve of one person. Can the entire plan of intimidation unravel completely? And if so, what will be the first sign of it? Every moment in life confronts us with choices, some quiet, almost imperceptible, and some thunderous, impossible to ignore. That night, standing behind the door, my wife faced one of the latter. Outside, the bikers waited, engines rumbling like distant thunder, the leader's presence radiating authority and uncertainty all at once. And in that suspended moment, I realized that the decisions we make under pressure reveal the true measure of a person, the strength hidden beneath ordinary appearances and the ripple effects that can alter everything around us. Choice is never just about action. Sometimes it's about stillness, about the decision to remain firm when every instinct screams to bend. The leader outside had come expecting reaction. A flinch, a hesitation, a breach of composure that would confirm his dominance. But when met with silence, with quiet courage, the expected narrative begins to shift. My wife's choice to remain steady at the door was more than defiance. It was a decision to define the moment on her terms, to hold the line against an orchestrated display of power. The leader's eyes darted across the street, catching the subtle hesitations of his followers. Micro-expressions, shifts in stance, fingers unconsciously adjusting helmets, all of them betraying doubt. His mind worked furiously, calculating contingencies, imagining scenarios, anticipating reactions, yet every analysis led to the same uncomfortable truth: control was no longer guaranteed. The plan James had meticulously orchestrated to impose fear was now dangling by a thread, and the thread was entirely dependent on a single choice. Mine, my wife's, the decision to yield or not. Outside, the world seemed to hold its breath. The streetlights flickered faintly in the night, shadows stretching like fingers over asphalt, and the wind whispered through the leaves, carrying the tension with it. The bikers waited, their synchronized intimidation faltering, every second amplifying the suspense. Each one understood, consciously or not, that the moment of decision was pivotal. One wrong move, one misjudged reaction, and the narrative could completely reverse. I watched the leader's eyes narrow, a flicker of calculation giving way to uncertainty. He had trained to control situations, to anticipate outcomes, to manipulate responses. Yet here he faced a human variable that he could not measure, a force of will that defied probability. And that uncertainty began to ripple outward. The others sensed it, too. Hesitation growing into doubt, doubt threatening to fracture cohesion, cohesion unraveling under the weight of an unbroken resolve. Choice, I realized, is never isolated. One person's decision has a gravity that pulls on everyone around them. The silent courage at the door sent invisible waves through the bikers, unsettling the chain of command, disrupting the rhythm of intimidation, challenging every assumption they carried into the night. And the leader, who had thought himself untouchable, began to recognize the danger in underestimating the power of one deliberate choice. Time stretched infinitely in those moments. Every breath taken behind the door was a statement. Every second of stillness amplified the suspense outside. The leader's mind churned with scenarios, every outcome balanced precariously, yet none offering a guarantee. The choice had become a pivot point. One action, one decision, capable of unleashing consequences that could not be contained. And then I noticed it, a subtle shift in his eyes, a hesitation that revealed the unspoken question that now consumed him. What happens if the expected reaction never comes? What happens if fear fails entirely? That question hung in the night, heavy and electric, seeping into the minds of every biker, twisting confidence into doubt. In that instant, the magnitude of choice became undeniable. It was not about who held physical power, who had orchestrated the intimidation, or who had come with the loudest engines and the most threatening presence. It was about a decision that could not be dictated, coerced, or predicted. The decision to stand, the decision to hold, the decision to face what had been meant, to break them, and to redefine what strength truly meant in the process. And as the silence stretched on, as hesitation rippled through the bikers, and as the leader wrestled with the impossible variable before him, the unspoken question filled the air like electricity: what will the next choice be, and who will be the first to reveal it? Every story has a moment when the scales shift, a point when tension becomes tangible and decisions take on irreversible weight. That night, the turning point arrived not with a yell or a crash, but with subtle energy, a shift in focus so delicate it might have gone unnoticed by anyone who hadn't been paying attention. Behind the door, my wife's calm remained unbroken, a quiet force that had already unsettled the bikers. Outside, every movement, every pause, every exhale became critical, as if the world itself had been holding its breath, waiting to see who would make the first real move. The leader, still poised at the front of the formation, now carried the full burden of uncertainty. His mind, trained for control and authority, was grappling with a reality he hadn't anticipated, someone who refused to fear them, who refused to yield to intimidation. Each second stretched longer than the last, and within it, every flicker of doubt was amplified, every hesitation a crack in the structure he had so carefully built. His eyes darted to his followers, to the subtle signs that something unexpected was growing among them, but none could give him the assurance he sought. Outside, the bikers shifted nervously. Engines hummed softly, as though reluctant to break the fragile pause that now dominated the street. The group that had once seemed unstoppable now teetered on the edge of indecision. Their formation wavered, subtle movements betraying their uncertainty. A hand sliding slightly from a throttle, a boot adjusting position, a helmet tilting in silent questioning. Even the bravest among them were caught in a moment they could not predict, and the energy of that unpredictability hung thick in the night air. Inside, my wife's presence became the fulcrum on which the entire evening balanced. Every breath she drew, every shift of her stance, every micro-expression carried weight far beyond the room. Courage, it became clear, does not need to shout to be heard, it only needs to be steadfast, unyielding, and precise. Her calm had become a mirror reflecting the internal collapse of the leader's certainty, and the subtler cracks in the biker's confidence only magnified the effect. The turning point was not a dramatic act, it was a realization. A moment when fear met unbroken resolve and paused, unsure of its next step. The leader's eyes narrowed, the smallest micro-expression revealing the conflict raging inside him. His carefully constructed plan was in danger of unraveling, not because of confrontation, but because of a choice, a single decision behind the door that refused to respond as expected. That choice now dictated every thought, every calculation, every silent command that passed through him. I could almost feel the mental gears turning in his mind. If she does not yield, if she does not break, what then? The question was unspoken, yet palpable, hanging between the streetlights, the shadows, the motorcycles, and the quiet room behind the door. His internal struggle radiated outward, subtly influencing each biker in the group. Hesitation spread like wildfire, infecting coordination with uncertainty, spreading doubt where confidence had previously dominated. Every detail became magnified in that moment of suspense. The faint rustle of leaves, the low vibration of idle engines, the whisper of wind through the trees. All seemed to echo the weight of what was unfolding. The world itself felt aligned with the tension, pressing the bikers and the leader to confront the instability they had never anticipated. And in that silence, one thought seemed to dominate the night: the first act to alter this balance would change everything. But who would take it? Inside, the room was still. My wife's composure remained unshaken, a constant that gave structure to the uncertainty outside. And yet the tension had evolved into something almost tangible. A question suspended in time, a moment pregnant with possibility. The leader's mind raced, aware that any misstep could amplify the collapse, aware that the slightest signal could pivot the situation entirely. He was caught between the instinct to act and the fear of acting wrongly, paralyzed by the invisible weight of the unknown. And in that suspended state, the turning point had fully arrived. The balance of power had shifted subtly but irrevocably. The bikers, trained to intimidate and dominate, were now unsure. Their leader, once so confident, was faltering under the weight of a decision he had not accounted for. The quiet courage behind the door had rewritten the rules, transforming suspense into a tangible force that demanded recognition, and the night waited, poised on the edge of revelation, for the first sign of what would come next. The night had transformed into a crucible of anticipation. What had begun as a display of intimidation had evolved into a test of resolve, and the unseen shift in power was almost imperceptible yet undeniable. Behind the door, my wife remained a silent force, unmoved and unbroken, while outside, the bikers shifted subtly as if the air itself carried new weight. It was in these moments, the ones between action and reaction, that the true nature of courage and control revealed itself. The leader at the front of the formation, once a figure of absolute authority, now seemed to carry the invisible burden of uncertainty. His mind raced, processing every hesitation in his group, every pause behind the door, every micro-expression that signaled the unraveling of his carefully orchestrated plan. The shift had begun quietly, almost imperceptibly, like a tremor before an earthquake, yet it was enough to destabilize him completely. He had counted on fear to bend the will of those inside, yet now he faced the reality that fear alone could not command submission. Outside, the bikers were aware of the tension, but could not define it. Their bodies betrayed it, subtle movements, fingers sliding slightly from grips, feet adjusting, helmets tilting, signs of an internal reckoning that mirrored their leader's uncertainty. Each rider sensed the shift, yet none could articulate it fully. The cohesion that had seemed impenetrable was dissolving, not through confrontation, but through the invisible force of quiet defiance. It was a lesson in human dynamics, a reminder that control exists only when the other side believes it, and when that belief falters, so too does authority. Inside, my wife's presence became a pivot around which the entire evening spun. Her calmness, her composure, her refusal to yield created a gravity that pulled uncertainty from outside into focus. Every breath she drew, every small motion, seemed to magnify the fractures in the leader's confidence. It was not a battle of strength or volume, but of perception. The unseen shift between expectation and reality, a shift that now dictated the rhythm of the night. The leader's eyes betrayed him. Beneath the visor, the micro-expressions of doubt, calculation, and internal debate flickered rapidly. Have we misjudged this? Is our presence enough to force compliance? The questions were unspoken yet vivid, each one amplifying the invisible tension that now dominated the street. His followers looked to him for direction, for reassurance, yet he could offer none. The shift was unseen but undeniable. It had begun inside him, where the illusion of control could no longer hold. The suspense stretched, thick and almost tangible. The night seemed to mirror the uncertainty, with every rustle of leaves, every distant hum of tires, every shadow deepening the sense that something fundamental had changed. The bikers, trained to enforce fear, now grappled with the reality that the outcome depended on forces they could not measure. One silent choice, one steadfast presence behind a door, had begun to rewrite the dynamics entirely. Inside, the air was dense with focus. My wife's eyes, unwavering, met mine briefly, a silent acknowledgement of the moment's significance. Courage, I realized, is not always dramatic, it is persistent, deliberate, and grounded in certainty. And in that certainty, the unseen shift had its fulcrum. A quiet power that the leader, for all his training and experience, could not control. The leader's thoughts became a storm. He scanned the street, the formation, the subtle hesitations, the body language of his team, and calculated the impossible. Any action could escalate the situation, yet inaction could allow the balance of power to slip entirely. His mind wrestled with outcomes, probabilities, and contingencies, yet all led to the same uncomfortable truth. The unseen shift had taken root, and he was at its mercy. And then I noticed it, the smallest flicker, the subtlest microchange in his posture, a twitch of the shoulder, the brief tilt of his head. It was almost imperceptible, but unmistakable to anyone paying attention. The shift was no longer just in the street, in the bikes, or in the shadows. It was inside him. The leader who had believed he controlled everything, now confronted by the realization that control had quietly, invisibly slipped away. Every second stretched longer. Every breath became laden with anticipation. The bikers waited, the leader wrestled with himself, and the quiet force behind the door remained steadfast. The unseen shift, once subtle, was now a tangible presence, reshaping intentions, recalibrating strategies, and leaving a single, haunting question suspended in the night: what will happen when he finally acknowledges that the balance has changed, and who will make the first move to reveal it? The night had stretched endlessly, each second a battle between expectation and reality, between fear and courage. From the pounding on the door to the silence that followed, from the unseen shift in power to the quiet defiance that had unspooled authority like thread from a spool, the events had reached a precipice. Every glance, every subtle movement outside, every breath behind the door was now amplified, carrying the weight of choices, consequences, and unspoken truths. The leader, once so certain of control, now hovered in a delicate balance between action and inaction. His mind raced through possibilities, trying to calculate the unpredictable, attempting to impose logic on a scenario that refused to be bound by expectation. The bikers around him mirrored his uncertainty, their confidence dissolving with every heartbeat, every micro-change they sensed in the atmosphere. Yet all of it circled back to a single point, a fulcrum of resolve, a quiet force that had changed everything without a single shout or gesture. Inside the house, my wife remained unwavering. She had become the axis upon which the night now turned, the measure against which courage, fear, and authority were weighed. Her presence was both calm and electric, absorbing the chaos outside and reflecting it back, magnifying the suspense that gripped the street. It was a lesson older than any confrontation, older than history itself. Strength is not always in action, but in the refusal to yield. Power is not always in dominance, but in presence. And yet, the suspense remained unbearable. The leader's eyes flickered toward the door once more, betraying the question that had haunted every second. What happens if the expected outcome never comes? What if control is no longer mine to command? That thought lingered, unspoken, almost tangible, carrying the weight of every choice he had made and every assumption he had relied upon. Every fiber of his being now acknowledged a possibility he had never allowed himself to consider, that the balance of power had quietly shifted, and the night's outcome was no longer certain. The street seemed to pulse with anticipation. Shadows stretched long, the wind whispered through the leaves, and even the faint rumble of the motorcycles felt muted under the gravity of the unseen tension. Every element outside mirrored the internal struggle of the leader, reflecting his doubt, his calculation, and the dawning awareness that he could no longer dictate the next moment. Every biker, trained to intimidate, waited silently, unsure who would act first, uncertain whether the scenario would play out according to plan or crumble under the invisible weight of courage that had silently redefined the rules. Inside the door remained a barrier, both physical and symbolic. Behind it, stillness had become a weapon, silence a strategy, and resolve a shield. Outside, uncertainty had transformed into suspense, a suspense so potent that it seemed to stretch time itself, freezing every movement, every thought, every decision. And at the center of it all, the leader's mind wrestled with the question that had no easy answer: who holds the power now, and what will I do when I finally have to confront it? In that suspended moment, the night held its breath. The unbroken courage inside the house had changed everything, yet the outcome remained unknown. The balance had shifted invisibly, but whether it would manifest in action or continue to simmer as tension, no one could yet say. Every second felt infinite, and every choice still awaited resolution, poised on the edge of revelation.